He was calm, polished, carried nothing but a briefcase and quiet dignity. Yet the moment he approached his first-class seat, they stopped him. "You must be in the wrong section." "Sir, no yelling, no chaos. Just a man who had earned his place being told, once again, that he didn't belong." But what if the man they dismissed wasn't just any passenger? What if the person they tried to humiliate at 30,000 feet could ground the entire airline? And what if the most powerful response was silence? This is the story of Solomon Rhys, a quiet giant, a black CEO, who turned a moment of prejudice into a national reckoning. Who were the people who judged him? What happened just 10 minutes later? And how did an ordinary flight become the most extraordinary lesson in justice, identity, and quiet power? Stay with us, because this story will make you angry, make you think, and might just make you cry. If this story already pulls at your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Let's begin. The boarding gate at San Diego International hummed with the soft static of morning flights, the scuffle of rolling suitcases, and the hollow announcements echoing overhead. Passengers sipped burnt airport coffee, adjusted their neck pillows, and shuffled forward with a kind of muted weariness that only early flights could summon. Flight 488 to New York. Skylure Airlines. Business Elite. First boarding call. Solomon Rhys stood quietly in line. Calm, precise, dressed in a navy wool overcoat and soft leather gloves. His suitcase was minimal black, unbranded, and worn at the corners from years of purposeful travel. He didn't fidget. He didn't scroll. He simply waited. When it was his turn to board, he stepped forward, extended his boarding pass and Skylure diamond card in one fluid motion. The woman at the gate, Erin Malloy, early 30s, hair pinned back with military neatness, glanced at the documents, then at Solomon. She didn't scan anything. Instead, her eyes flicked down his coat, paused briefly on the dark brown of his skin, then settled on the tag that read 2A. Her lips pursed, not in confusion, in judgment. "You're in the wrong line," she said flatly, not loud, but audible enough for the passengers behind him to hear. "First class only." She didn't blink. She didn't gesture. Just stood there, arms crossed, smile absent. Solomon tilted his head, not in disbelief, but in calculation. "I believe this is the right line," he replied softly. His voice was low, measured, like someone trained not to echo the tone of disrespect he was offered. Erin held out her hand. "Let me see that." He handed over the boarding pass and the card, still without scanning. She stared at the printed seat number. Then she did something unexpected. She tore the boarding pass in half. "Try economy," she said coldly, handing back the scraps, "or wherever people like you usually sit." The hallway behind them hushed. Not dramatically, but enough. A cough cut short. A zipper stopped mid-pull. A man in a tailored blazer lowered his coffee cup. A woman adjusted her scarf but didn't say a word. Solomon said nothing. He looked down at the torn pass in his hand, then calmly bent to pick up the smaller piece that had floated to the floor. He pressed the two halves together for a moment, as if checking if they might somehow realign. Then he stepped forward, past Erin, past her silence. He walked down the jet bridge and boarded the plane. Inside the cabin of Skylure 488, the air smelled faintly of leather and citrus disinfectant. The lights were soft, the aisle polished, the seats wide and curved in gentle cocoons of privilege. There were only 10 first-class seats on this model, and Solomon had paid for 2A. He reached it, paused, and sat down. He didn't make a scene. He didn't look around. He simply sat with his back straight, hands resting lightly on the boarding pass fragments, eyes ahead, breathing slow. A few minutes passed. Aaron entered the cabin briskly, scanning rows. When she saw him, she froze, as if startled that her earlier dismissal hadn't resulted in obedience. "You weren't cleared," she said, approaching. "That seat is not verified." Solomon raised his eyes. Not aggressively, not pleading, just present. "I believe I have the confirmation," he said gently. "I don't see your name on the manifest," she snapped. Solomon offered no response. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back though the seat wouldn't recline. He noticed that the light above him didn't turn on. The call button didn't respond. His seat had been quietly disabled. He didn't frown, but something behind his eyes flickered. Not anger, not surprise. Something older. A quiet recognition. He had seen this before, just in different uniforms. Aaron crossed her arms and stood nearby, clearly waiting for him to stand up, to give in, to leave quietly, as if dignity was something she was allowed to grant or remove. But Solomon didn't move. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim black device, a tablet encrypted, unbranded, humming silently to life. From across the aisle, a teenage girl noticed. She tapped her phone and started recording, subtly. A man in seat 1B, reading The Economist, looked up briefly over the rim of his glasses, then back down, but slower now. Nobody said a word, yet everyone knew something was happening, and it had just begun. The cabin of Skylure Flight 488 seemed to pause. Not physically, no alarms, no crew announcements, but atmospherically. Like the pressure had shifted, like the air had grown heavier, thicker, more aware of itself. Solomon Rhys sat motionless in seat 2A, still holding the torn boarding pass, still holding his silence. Across the aisle, the man in 1B peered once again over his reading glasses. This time, he didn't return to his magazine. He simply watched, 2 rows back. A woman with frosted hair pulled her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her lips twitched slightly, not in sympathy, but in discomfort, as if his presence, his refusal to be displaced, was an act of defiance she wasn't prepared to witness before takeoff. Solomon felt them all. He always did. The weight of eyes pretending not to stare. The stares pretending not to carry judgment. The judgment pretending not to matter. Erin Malloy returned from the front of the cabin, her stride faster now, determined. The performative calm in her posture had faded. In its place, the rigid energy of someone who thought they'd been disrespected and needed to set things straight. She stopped at his row. "That seat isn't active in the system," she repeated, this time louder, letting the words hang like a warning. Solomon didn't flinch. "You haven't scanned my credentials," he replied, his tone gentle, composed. "Sir, I've already explained." "No," he interrupted. "You assumed." A few heads turned now, just slightly. He continued, his voice low and firm. "You looked at me. You didn't verify. You dismissed. And then you destroyed proof." He placed the torn halves of the boarding pass on the tray in front of him, like evidence in a quiet trial. Erin opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a voice came from row 3. "Is there a problem?" It was Naomi Vu, a woman in her late 20s, smartly dressed in a denim jacket and headphones around her neck. She'd been recording since the gate. Her phone was now in her lap, facing up. "Still rolling." "No problem," Aaron said quickly. "Just verifying some system errors." Naomi raised her eyebrows. "Just looks like you tore up a ticket without checking it," she replied. "That's all." Erin turned back to Solomon. "I'm going to have to speak with the pilot," she said curtly, and left without waiting for a reply. Solomon breathed in and let the breath sit for a moment before exhaling slowly. He wasn't surprised. This wasn't new. The faces changed. The uniforms changed. The script didn't. But inside, something else stirred. Not anger. Not yet. Something deeper. A dull ache. Not because he wasn't used to this, but because he was. That's what wore a person down. Not the surprise of discrimination, but its predictability. His mind wandered, just for a moment, to a boardroom in Atlanta 2 years ago. A VP named Marcus who had told him, with a smile, that the company just wasn't ready for his kind of leadership. The smile had been worse than the words. That polite smile people wear when they're pushing you out, but want credit for keeping it civil. He'd left the room that day and bought the company 2 quarters later. He hadn't raised his voice then either. Just changed the locks. Back in seat 2A. He opened the tablet resting on his lap. The interface blinked to life, encrypted systems, corporate access points, private nodes routed through Vanguard Infrastructure Group, the empire he built quietly, one acquisition at a time. He tapped a few keys, brought up the airline manifest. There he was, Solomon Rhys, seat 2A, verified, paid in full, linked to corporate account VX197. Still, the system had flagged him ineligible. He sighed, and beneath that sigh was something more dangerous than outrage. Intention. From economy, a man stepped into the aisle. Esteban Mora, dressed in neutral grays, held a coffee cup but didn't sip. He walked slowly toward the front of the plane, made eye contact with Solomon just briefly. No words, just a small, deliberate nod. Then he moved past toward the restroom. Solomon watched him go. Esteban worked in ethics compliance. He knew. He'd seen. That was enough for now. The seat next to Solomon remained empty. By design. He had chosen 2A on purpose. Not for the legroom, not for the exclusivity, but because he knew it would provoke discomfort in certain people. He knew where their eyes would fall the moment he sat down, and how they would pretend it wasn't about him, but about policy. He didn't want confrontation, but he didn't run from it either. Solomon closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, he spoke under his breath. "You can erase names. You can reroute data, but you can't fake who belongs." His voice was barely above a whisper, but in that silence, it felt like thunder. Solomon Rhys leaned gently against the headrest of seat 2A. It didn't move, no recline, no give, just a quiet mechanical resistance that said not for you. He tried the reading light overhead. Nothing. Pressed the call button. No tone. No response. He didn't frown. He didn't sigh. He simply noted it. One more subtle rejection. It was the kind of thing that didn't come with a name badge. The kind of sabotage that left no fingerprints. Just discomfort. Quiet. Invisible discomfort. The kind you were expected to endure without complaint. A soft shuffle across the aisle. Naomi Vu sat straighter in 3C, eyes narrowing behind her phone lens. Her camera zoomed in just slightly, capturing the sequence of tiny failures around seat 2A. She wasn't live yet, not this moment, not until she had more. But she was watching, documenting, in case the system decided to erase what it had done. A few rows behind, in 5B, Cam Lively sat hunched over a silver Skylure crew tablet. He wore the same slate gray vest as the rest of the tech support staff, but his shoulders twitched when Naomi's lens passed over him. Cam had noticed Solomon at the gate. and he'd been quick to pull a system override when Aaron whispered something about a ticket mismatch. Cam didn't hate Solomon. He just didn't think people like him fit the branding. High-touch clients want familiarity. He'd once said in a staff chat, familiarity sells trust. Familiarity, in his mind, had a color palette, and Solomon Rhys didn't match it. Up front, Erin Malloy returned to her post like a queen re-entering court, her step sharp, her expression forced into something resembling service. She leaned toward Solomon's seat again. "I'm going to ask one more time. Do you have proof of purchase?" Solomon didn't look at her. He held up his sleek black tablet, tilted slightly so only she could see. The screen displayed his Skylure Diamond membership, full itinerary, and payment confirmation. His name, Solomon Rhys. Seat 2A. Status verified elite access. A beat passed. Erin blinked, then scoffed. "This could be a mock-up," she said. "Too loud. Anyone can make a fake screen these days." The man in 1B glanced up again. Longer this time. Naomi, still silent, raised an eyebrow. Behind Erin, the cabin lights flickered. The fasten seatbelt sign remained on. But the real tension wasn't coming from turbulence. It came from proximity to power. Power they hadn't recognized. Power they'd dismissed because it didn't wear the right shade of confidence. Solomon turned slightly. "Have I raised my voice? Ms. Malloy?" he asked quietly. "No." "Have I disobeyed any command?" "No, but have I insulted you?" She hesitated. "No." He nodded. "Then I'd like to remain in silence, as you resolve your manifest issues." He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply reclaimed the space she had tried to deny him. At that moment, the plane's PA system crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently delayed on the tarmac for a brief systems check. We expect to be airborne shortly. Thank you for your patience. A standard delay, 10 minutes. But Solomon knew better. In 10 minutes, the system could be rewritten. And this time, he was the architect. Down the aisle, Cam's fingers flew across the tablet. He initiated a second-level override, one that would flag 2A as inactive for maintenance. It wasn't true, but it would be enough to justify a removal. He leaned into the crew intercom. "Flagged. Seat 2A is down. Verified by tech." Erin nodded without hesitation. Confirmation bias felt like truth when it arrived on schedule. But Solomon wasn't alone in the code. He had designed this infrastructure VX core, Skylure's internal seat operations framework, and on a parallel encrypted line, back at Vanguard HQ, Marin King was already in the system, watching every line of manipulation, documenting every change, erasing nothing. Erin stepped forward again, this time with false sympathy. "I'm afraid we'll need to move you temporarily. Mr. Rhys, the seat has been flagged for service safety reasons. You understand?" He didn't respond. She forced a laugh. "It's not personal." He finally looked up. "Then why is it predictable?" Silence. Tight. Cold. Passengers shifted in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or pretend not to see. Only Naomi lifted her phone higher. Now going live. Her caption: "Skylure Airlines disables seat of black CEO. Pretends it's technical. Watch this unfold. Boss flight bias. Bars in 2A gate." From the back galley, Esteban Mora watched his screen flash. Internal system logs were syncing irregularly. That meant external tampering. He didn't need to see who was doing it. He already knew. And so did the system. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as flight attendants prepared for takeoff. But the plane hadn't moved. It still sat at gate C12 engine silent, surrounded by the illusion of motion bags being loaded, safety checks, Last calls but grounded. Fully, quietly. Just like Solomon Rhys. Seat 2A wasn't disabled. It was neutralized. And every click on a crew tablet, every glance from the flight staff, felt like confirmation that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an orchestration. Erin Malloy stood near the galley, arms crossed, whispering with Cam Lively. Her voice didn't carry, but her gestures did, pointing, smirking, watching. From her perch, she could see him, still seated, still dignified, still not moving. Erin didn't know his name. Not really. She had seen it, sure glanced at the past she tore apart. But she hadn't felt it, hadn't taken it seriously. To her, he was just another well-dressed someone who'd wandered too far from his assigned role. But she was about to learn. From row 1C, Ava Green, polished in pearls and precision-cut heels, leaned across the aisle. "Darling," she said, with the oily grace of inherited money, "would you like to trade seats? You might be more comfortable in the back. Less attention." Her tone was light, her smile practiced, but the intent was clear. This wasn't an offer. It was a condescension, cloaked in civility. Solomon turned his head. For the first time, he smiled, a small tired smile. "Discomfort," he said gently, "isn't where you sit. It's how the world's been trained to see you when you sit there." Ava blinked. She wasn't used to being answered in complete sentences, especially ones that didn't shrink beneath her status. She pulled back without another word. Naomi Vu caught every word on her stream. The chat exploded. Did he just bar after bar? This man speaks in boardroom thunder. And still, Solomon said nothing more. He just rested his hands calmly over the torn boarding pass and watched the chaos build around him like a wave he refused to outrun. A ping lit up Naomi's phone. Direct message. From an anonymous account. 3 words. Watch the envelope. She scanned the cabin. Erin had just taken something from Ava, a folded piece of white paper. No transaction, no handshake, just a passing of power. Like it was routine. Naomi zoomed in. Erin's hand slid the envelope into her skirt pocket with practiced ease. No hesitation, no shame. At the front of the plane, Solomon powered up his tablet again. He tapped twice and pulled up Skylure's internal crew roster. Encrypted login. VX access granted. Erin Malloy. Cam Lively. Ava Green listed as guest investor. Skylure East. He stared at the screen, then tapped again. This time unlocking the encrypted archive embedded on the device Phase Sigma protocol. Everything they'd done was being logged in real time on his system. Because Skylure didn't just fly his plane. Skylure licensed his technology, VX Core. He'd built the seat allocation software, the passenger profiling logic, the override access system. He hadn't designed it to be weaponized. But today, it would be. Just not by them. "Sir," Erin returned, her voice smoother now. "Pretend polished. While we continue sorting your seat issue, can I offer you something to drink? Water? Perhaps?" She didn't wait for an answer. She reached for a cup, poured from the pitcher on the tray, and accidentally let it spill directly into his lap, a thin splash of cold along his tailored slacks. She gasped. "Oh no, I'm so sorry these things happen. No one bought the performance." Naomi gasped softly. Cam watched, frozen. Ava crossed her legs and smirked. Solomon calmly took a napkin from the tray, dabbed once at his hand, then gently laid the napkin on the armrest. "This plane," he said evenly, "has a leak far worse than that cup." In the cabin's rear, Esteban Mora received the second ping. It contained internal system logs. They showed Cam Lively's login just minutes before boarding. Time-stamped entry manual void on seat 2A. Violation falsification of federally regulated manifest data. Esteban didn't rush to act. He just forwarded the file to FOA Oversight, to DOJ Transport Compliance, to the Vanguard Ethics Board, and to Marin King. Solomon's eyes remained forward, his hands still. But inside, everything had begun to move. It was quiet again. Too quiet. But not the peaceful kind. No. This was the kind of quiet that makes people shift in their seats, pretend to read, pretend to sleep, pretend not to notice that the air had changed. Solomon Rhys sat in 2A, wet slacks drying slowly beneath the recirculated air, but his dignity untouched. His spine remained straight. His hand still rested calmly on his lap, but his mind was moving like a machine. Behind him, in row 6D, an elderly man adjusted his hearing aid and leaned toward his wife. "Is that the tech guy?" "The one from Forbes," he whispered. His wife squinted, then widened her eyes slightly. "I think it is. The Rhys fellow. Built half the airline's tech stack. Didn't he?" They didn't move to help, but they remembered. People often did. Just not until it was too late. At the same time, in seat 3C, Naomi Vu's livestream now had 87,000 viewers and counting. Her captions had shifted tone. No longer just passive commentary. Now it was activism. Why are we pretending this is about a seat? This is targeting. He's being harassed. Quietly. Systematically. And y'all are watching. This is what bias looks like when it wears a smile and holds a drink tray. She didn't film Solomon directly anymore. She filmed around him. The behavior. The subtle manipulations. The hush that swallowed the truth. And the silence of those who knew but said nothing. The cockpit door opened. Captain Reed Halverson stepped out. A man who looked like he'd been born inside an aviator's manual slick hair. Too white a smile. Too clean a uniform. He didn't speak to the cabin. He didn't need to. He walked straight to Erin, whispered something. She nodded quickly, almost grateful. Then he approached Solomon. "Mr. Rhys," the captain said. "No, sir. No courtesy. Just the name. Flat and clipped, like a file pulled from the wrong drawer. We've been informed there's a mechanical issue with your seat. You'll need to be relocated to the rear of the aircraft." Solomon met his eyes. Calmly. "I decline." The captain blinked. "Pardon, I will not be moving. It's a safety issue." "No," Solomon replied. "It's a social issue being disguised as a safety one, and I'm not playing along." Halverson's jaw shifted. Passengers turned to listen now. The tension had gone from quiet to loud, without anyone raising a voice. "From the front," Ava Green scoffed. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself, loudly enough for the row to hear. "If I had known this flight was going to be a stage for whatever this is, I'd have taken the jet." She wanted to be heard. But Solomon didn't flinch. He wasn't performing. He was enduring, and quietly. Rebuilding. Inside the crew's digital logs, a second layer of data had begun to emerge. Marin King, still deep within Skylure's encrypted server back in New York, had activated VX Shadow Mode, a dormant feature Solomon had hard-coded into the framework years ago. It recorded everything, live, unaltered, from the moment Solomon's name had been flagged at the gate, to the moment his boarding pass had been lost, to the command line that had deactivated 2A's recline function, time-stamped, authenticated, undeniable. Marin wasn't just watching. She was archiving a reckoning. In the aft galley, Esteban Moore received the final verification ping. VX log ID 0039, violation tampering with FAA certified equipment log for discriminatory purpose. Users E, Malloy, C, Lively, authorized by Cap R. Halverson. Esteban took a deep breath. He adjusted his glasses and walked toward the front of the plane. Meanwhile, Solomon's internal monologue grew heavier. Not angry yet, but layered with that familiar ache. Why must I always explain my humanity before I'm allowed to sit comfortably? Why does silence make them comfortable, while truth makes them tremble? Why am I always asked to shrink to preserve their version of peace? These weren't questions for the airline. They were questions for the world. And still, he remained still. Esteban reached the front. He nodded once at Solomon, then turned to the captain. Sir, I need to speak with you, privately, regarding a federal violation. Halverson frowned. This is not the time now, Esteban said, voice even but unshakable. Unless you'd prefer the DOJ make this announcement for you when we land. And suddenly, the plane got very quiet again, not with fear, but with attention, because something had shifted. And for the first time, it wasn't Solomon being asked to move. Captain Reed Halverson stepped back. The words federal violation were still echoing inside his skull as he followed Esteban Mora toward the cockpit. Not because he didn't understand them, but because he did. Too well. He had flown hundreds of flights, managed dozens of crews. He knew what could be bent and what couldn't. This wasn't a delay anymore. This was a line, and he had just been caught crossing it. Back in seat 2A. Solomon Rhys sat unchanged. From the outside, he looked passive, patient, but inside, a familiar mixture of resolve and restraint stirred just beneath the surface. He had seen the signs before, a fake smile hiding real contempt. Politeness used as a weapon. Systems designed to fail people like him, quietly. But today wasn't about rage. It was about remembrance. They've forgotten I built this plane's bones, he thought. Now they'll learn who wired its nerves. In the cockpit, Esteban didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He placed the VX log report on the flight panel. Cam Lively accessed and modified the seat manifest through unauthorized admin override. Esteban said, Steady. Your initials appear on the approval chain. Halverson looked at the document and swallowed. No harm was done, he said defensively. We harm doesn't have to leave bruises. Captain. Esteban cut in. Sometimes it leaves data trails. And Skylure had a trail now. One impossible to erase. Meanwhile, Naomi Vu's stream had surpassed 147,000 live viewers. Comments flooded and man sitting there like a CEO in a storm. This is exactly how calm power speaks. Petty crew, about to be very unemployed. Wait, he built the system. Oh, they done messed up. She paused the live briefly to send a single tweet. Breaking passenger who's being harassed. He's Solomon Rhys. Yes, that Rhys. The man who designed Skylure's digital infrastructure. You're watching a company implode, from the inside out. By the time she reopened the stream, it had tripled in views. The world was now watching. In seat 3D, a young boy nudged his mother. Mom, is that the man who made the cloud thing for my tablet? She looked at Solomon, then back at her son. I think it is. She didn't say anything else, but she looked again, longer this time, in the crew galley. Aaron Malloy's hands began to tremble, not because she felt guilty, but because she'd finally been seen. For the first time in years of subtle abuse, coded bias, and unspoken superiority, someone had pulled the curtain back. And now she was standing on the wrong side of it. Are we even flying this thing? She snapped at Cam, trying to mask her fear and anger. Cam was pale now, clicking rapidly into his tablet, but the override commands weren't working anymore. VX had locked him out. They no longer had access. Meanwhile, Solomon tapped a command into his tablet. One line. Simple. Execute VXO Clean Window Protocol. All data from this flight's crew manifest, incident recordings, and override codes would now be transmitted directly to Skylure's Board of Directors, Federal Aviation Administration, and 3 civil rights oversight firms already watching his account for flagged misuse of travel software. This wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. The captain returned from the cockpit. He cleared his throat at the front of the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a technical difficulty that may delay departure. We appreciate your patience. No eye contact with Solomon, no explanation, just the last reflex of a man losing control of the room he once commanded. Passengers looked around now, some curious, others tense, some guilty. But they knew something had shifted, something they wouldn't be able to pretend not to have seen. In the back row, a woman black, mid-50s, traveling alone, folded her hands in her lap. She looked at Solomon from afar and nodded, a simple gesture, one that said, "I see you." Solomon noticed, and for a moment he let the silence settle. The plane hadn't moved, but the story already had. The seatbelt sign stayed off. The plane hadn't moved an inch, but the energy on board it was racing, faster than any aircraft could fly. Captain Halverson sat stiffly in the cockpit, staring at the instruments that now meant very little. He hadn't lost control of a plane before. But now, it wasn't the aircraft slipping away from him. It was the narrative. And the longer they sat at the gate, the more it unraveled. Every delay exposed another thread, another oversight. Another face turned towards Solomon Rhys, not with suspicion, but recognition. Out in the cabin, the tension was shifting, not vanishing, just changing direction. Passengers who had once rolled their eyes now looked at Solomon with something closer to respect. A few even leaned toward each other, whispering, "This guy's legit." They really messed with the wrong one. How do you accidentally tamper with the seat of the man who designed your whole tech ecosystem? Solomon, for his part, didn't speak. He just watched, listened, felt. There was a kind of ache in his chest. Not pain, not yet, but that quiet throb of disappointment so deep it felt ancestral. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen this kind of targeted treatment before, but this time felt different. This time, they'd done it on his own canvas. This time, they disrespected him in the very system he'd built to make travel smoother for everyone. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and let it linger. Back in seat 3C, Naomi Vu was now typing furiously. She wasn't just live streaming anymore. She was writing a thread, a long one. Thread. I'm on flight NA777, where the lead architect of Skylure's flight optimization tech, Solomon Rhys, is being systematically pushed out of his first-class seat due to blatant profiling and behind-the-scenes manipulation. What follows is a digital autopsy of institutional bias recorded in real time. She listed timestamps, screenshots, crew movements, passenger quotes. By the 6th tweet, it had already passed 400K impressions. In the crew galley, Erin Malloy stood frozen. She hadn't spoken since the captain returned. Every word from Naomi's thread felt like a nail in the coffin of her career. She glanced at Cam, who was still frantically trying to override VX security on his tablet, but the system had locked them both out. The logs were immutable, the evidence irrefutable. And now, public. "I'm not going down for this," she whispered. But she already knew she was going down. The intercom clicked on. It was the captain again. His voice cracked slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued delay. We're awaiting further clearance from Operations Control. Thank you for your patience." But it wasn't just operations anymore. The decision about takeoff had shifted way up, to the corporate suite, to the people who now knew that their lead systems designer had been humiliated on their flagship flight, on a plane running his own code, by staff he didn't even approve. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Esteban Mora had locked himself in the lavatory to make a call, a secure line, straight to Marin King. "Esteban," she said instantly, "VX protocol registered a full breach. You were right. How bad Cam and Aaron created a shadow command profile, bypassed passenger assignments. It's all there. Public, yet Naomi Vu is live tweeting it. Front page by morning." He exhaled. "So what, now we wait," Marin said. "This isn't about seat 2A anymore." She paused. "It's about whether this plane deserves to take off at all." In row 5A, a man in a suit finally spoke up. To no one in particular. Why don't they just apologize? His wife looked at him, eyes tired. Because if they say sorry, it means they did something wrong. He shifted uncomfortably. Because now he wasn't sure if he was just a passenger anymore. He might have been a witness. Solomon remained still. But internally, he churned. Do I push harder? Do I let the exposure speak for itself? Is this about me or about something larger? He wasn't just battling the flight crew. He was battling the question that had haunted every moment of success he'd ever earned. How much of myself do I have to prove? Just to sit in peace. And this time, he didn't want peace. He wanted change. The call came at 11:13 a.m. Straight from the top floor of Skylure's Sky Suite headquarters in New York. It wasn't routed through dispatch. It bypassed every terminal, every assistant, every protocol. It went directly to the cockpit of Flight NACE-7. The display on the captain's console lit up with a name that made Reed Halverson's throat dry up. PAX Priority Silas Marin, CEO. He didn't answer right away. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew what that call meant. There would be no more hiding behind flight codes and policy language. This wasn't a conversation. It was a reckoning. In seat 2A, Solomon Rhys leaned back, eyes steady. He had just received a quiet ping on his device. Encrypted. Simple. From Marin King. "Silas, just made contact. It's happening." Far back in seat 14B, a college student opened his news app. The top headline, "Breaking Tech Genius Solomon Rhys." Profiled on Skylure flight Airline faces PR firestorm. By the time the student looked up, the words had made it to half the plane. Screens were lighting up, gasps, murmurs, a wave of shifting eyes, and suddenly, the energy aboard NA-177 turned inside out. What began as an isolated act of discrimination was now a national flashpoint inside the cockpit. Halverson finally answered the call. He didn't even get a hello out before Silas Marin's voice came through, sharp and deliberate. "Captain Halverson, you are currently taxi stalled at gate 32B with Solomon Rhys seated in 2A. Can you confirm?" "Yes, sir. He's on board." "And are you aware of Mr. Rhys's role in developing the entire VX logistics interface that supports 92% of our operations?" "I am now." There was silence. Then Silas spoke slowly. "You will keep that plane grounded. You will not move 1 inch until I say so. You will escort Flight Attendant Cam Lively off the aircraft immediately, and you will prepare to surrender your own credentials at landing." Halverson swallowed. He didn't argue. He just said yes. Mr. Marin. Aaron Malloy saw the captain emerge from the cockpit with a face like ash. She knew it was coming, but when he spoke, it still hit like a punch. Cam. Off the plane. Now. Cam blinked. What I said off. You're being removed from crew status. VX override confirmed. Escorts waiting. Passengers turned to look. Phones came out, and Cam Lively, who once sneered as he downgraded Solomon Rhys, now stood trembling in front of an entire cabin that knew what he'd done. A few people clapped. One person booed. Most just stared in stunned silence. Solomon didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just looked ahead. Focused. Present. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about illumination. A system had been exposed, and the first fracture had become a break. Back in VX headquarters, Marin King put down her headset and rubbed her eyes. Stage 1 complete, she whispered to herself. Behind her, data analysts scrambled to re-verify timestamps, flight crew identity markers, and digital proof of seat tampering. Every click was another coffin nail in a scandal that was now international. Meanwhile, Naomi Vu had turned her stream to a lower volume. She was narrating softly now, respectfully. We just witnessed something big. A man just got justice at 30,000 feet before the plane even took off. But this isn't just about Solomon Rhys. This is about how systems protect the wrong people until the right ones take the controls back. The chat was ablaze fire, Cam. NA777 will go down in history. How's the crew still on board after this? What if this happened to someone who wasn't Solomon Rhys? The question hung in the air. In seat 7C, a teenage girl with brown braids whispered to her mom, "Will that man be okay?" Her mother smiled gently. "He already is. But they tried to hurt him." "Yes," her mom said, "and look how strong he stayed." The girl looked toward Solomon with wide eyes. To her, he looked like a statue, made not of marble, but of steel. In the aisle, Cam Lively was finally escorted out. The doors opened. Sunlight spilled through. But for him, it felt cold, as if every spotlight now burned with judgment. And just like that, he was gone. They finally closed the door. Not the door of justice, but the actual plane door. Cam Lively was off the aircraft. The VX system override was restored, and the cabin had gone quiet. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence that comes after a storm. When everyone is still processing what just passed through, the engines hummed to life. Flight NA777 had clearance, but even with the aircraft rolling toward the runway, something heavier than gravity still weighed down every row. This wasn't a routine takeoff anymore. It was a flight under scrutiny, a vessel of truth strapped in beside hundreds of blinking devices and wide, curious eyes. In seat 2A, Solomon Rhys sat still. His body faced forward, but his mind, it wasn't in the cabin anymore. It was in the past. He saw himself at 23, walking into his first investor pitch wearing his only clean blazer, speaking in a calm voice he'd rehearsed all night, only to be asked if he was the intern or the delivery guy. He remembered being told, "We're just not sure if your vibe fits the leadership image." He'd smiled then, soft, controlled, unshakable. But inside he had never forgotten, because these weren't isolated incidents. They were fragments, pieces of a bigger, uglier pattern. And today, on this plane, that pattern finally cracked wide open. Over in seat 3C, Naomi Vu lowered her camera. She'd stopped filming, not because there was nothing left to say, but because now It was time to listen. She turned to Solomon. "Would you mind if I asked you something?" He glanced at her. "Of course." She hesitated. "Why didn't you speak up earlier? When they moved you? When the whispers started?" Solomon gave a small breath of a smile. "Because I wasn't sure if I was supposed to fight or endure." Naomi blinked. He continued. "Sometimes when you're a black man in a tailored suit and you speak with confidence, they don't see strength. They see threat." He looked out the window. "So I've learned to choose my moments. This was one of them." At that moment, a flight attendant, one of the newer ones, approached slowly. She looked nervous, uncertain. She knelt slightly beside Solomon's seat and whispered, "I'm sorry." He turned, gently, for not saying something, for knowing something was off, and not stepping in. Solomon looked at her kindly. "Then you've already done more than most." She exhaled. "Thank you." "No," he said. "Thank you for not staying silent now." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Halverson was preparing for takeoff, but something in him had shifted too. He thought about his own career, how he'd once warned his nephew not to dress too urban for a job interview. He thought it was helping. Now, he saw it for what it was, a reflection of a system so deeply ingrained, even the well-meaning became gatekeepers. He pressed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now third in line for takeoff. Flight time to Seattle is 5 hours and 13 minutes. We thank you for your patience today." And after a pause, he added, "We also thank you for your attention." He clicked the mic off, but his words lingered in the cabin. In seat 7C, the little girl turned again to her mom. Did the man win? Her mother thought for a second, then said, "No, baby, not yet. But he's sitting there." "Yes. Then, what does winning look like?" The mother smiled and whispered, "When no one has to fight for that seat ever again." Solomon closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to reflect, to breathe, to hold on to the strength it took to sit in that seat, not as a power move, but as a stand-in for every unseen battle fought by people who looked like him. This wasn't the end of the story. It was a crack in the door, and the pressure behind it was rising. Cruising altitude 38,000 feet, speed 520 knots, distance to Seattle 263 miles, time 4 hours and 58 minutes. But for Solomon Rhys, it wasn't just a flight. It was a meditation. A quiet reckoning, suspended in a pressurized shell, hurtling through sky and memory. The seat beneath him had once been denied. Now it held him like a throne made of steel and scars. Not because the fight was over, but because this moment of stillness was earned. Across the aisle, Naomi Vu was typing. She wasn't live streaming now. She was writing. Something deeper, a long-form piece that would live beyond a viral clip. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call for outrage. He sat in silence, and that silence shook the walls of power. Solomon Rhys didn't need the world to know who he was. He just needed them to remember what they did. In row 5, a man in a charcoal suit read the same headlines Naomi had once scrolled. And for the first time in a long time, he closed his laptop with a slow, contemplative breath. He looked around, saw faces he hadn't noticed before, different colors, different expressions, same flight. He realized he'd flown this route a dozen times, but he'd never really seen the people on board. Until today. Farther back in row 10, 2 cabin crew members whispered, "Did you know who he was?" "No idea. I just knew he looked important." That's the thing. He didn't look important. He was important. They both fell quiet. Then one of them said, "Maybe we should stop deciding who looks like they belong." In seat 2A. Solomon glanced out the window. Below him, clouds curled like tides. Above, nothing but blue. He thought about his father, how he used to take Solomon to the airport as a kid. They'd sit in the waiting area, watching planes take off. His father would say, one day, "Son, you'll build something that flies higher than all of them." Back then, he thought it was just about engineering. Now he understood. His father didn't mean machines. He meant truth. He meant dignity. He meant the courage to rise, even when they tried to anchor you with doubt. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. Aaron Malloy's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be starting in-flight service shortly. If there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. Simple, standard." But this time she meant it, because Aaron had witnessed what uncomfortable really looked like. And it wasn't about turbulence or tray tables. It was the feeling of watching injustice and doing nothing. She wouldn't make that mistake again. As carts rolled down the aisle, a soft moment arrived. A small boy, maybe 7, approached Solomon with wide eyes. He held something in his hand, a paper napkin with scribbles, a drawing of a stick figure in a suit, standing on a mountaintop. Underneath, in shaky lettering, "You're my hero." Solomon looked up. The boy's mother was nearby, watching nervously. Solomon bent down, took the napkin gently. "Thank you," he said. The boy beamed, then ran back to his seat. And Solomon, he blinked once, then looked out the window again. The sky hadn't changed, but something in him had softened. Meanwhile, in the Skylure executive boardroom, panic was brewing, PR directors scrambling, legal teams whispering. But Silas Marin sat quietly, hands clasped. He wasn't angry. He was aware. For the first time, he saw his own company's blind spots, his own silence, and he realized this wasn't about one man in seat 2A. It was about what that seat represented. A space that people had been denied for generations, not because they lacked merit, but because they looked like they didn't belong. That ends now. It had to. Back on flight NA-777, the in-flight monitor showed their progress. Still 3,100 miles to go. Still hours from Seattle. But something had already landed. A new awareness. A quiet shift. A truth too loud to ignore. The captain's voice broke the hush. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Seattle. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts." The cabin stirred. Seat backs clicked upright. Window shades lifted like eyelids, adjusting to the light. But in seat 2A, Solomon Rhys was already grounded. Not by gravity, by clarity, by something far more permanent than a touchdown. The city stretched below a web of steel and water and lives. Each highway a story. Each streetlight a decision. Each roof a chapter in a book most people never bother to read. He thought, we'd land where we choose, even if others try to steer us off course. Across the aisle, Naomi Vu hit save on her draft. The headline read, "The Man in Two." What happens when we stop accepting less? She wasn't trying to make him a symbol. He was already human. But his restraint, his composure, that was its own quiet rebellion. And it deserved to be written in full sentences, not hashtags. The plane dipped gently. In row 7, the little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. Is he going to fix the airline? The mother thought, then said, No, baby. He already did something bigger. what he made them look at themselves. Up front, Captain Halverson exhaled as he guided the aircraft into its final turn. He didn't usually think about passengers, not their faces, not their feelings. But today, he thought about how many times silence had kept people comfortable, how many times it had cost someone like Solomon their dignity just for existing in a space they earned. He made a quiet promise to himself. No more of that. Not on my watch. The wheels touched down. Soft. Clean. A landing like any other. But as the brakes slowed the jet, it felt like the end of a silence that had echoed too long. The seatbelt signs turned off. People stood, but slower than usual, as if they knew something had changed, even if they couldn't name it. Solomon remained seated for a moment, then stood tall. He adjusted his blazer, checked the napkin drawing tucked into his pocket, and stepped into the aisle. The front galley was crowded, but this time, the space parted for him. Not out of fear, out of recognition. Erin Malloy stood there, eyes steady, shoulders straight. She didn't say much, just extended her hand. "Mr. Rhys," she said. He took it. "Thank you," she added, voice low but firm. He nodded. "I just sat down." She shook her head. "No, sir. You stood up for something most of us missed." On the jet bridge, a small cluster of gate staff waited, eyes wide, unsure. But at the end of the corridor, a man in a Navy suit stepped forward. Silas Marin, CEO of Skylure. He wasn't flanked by security, no entourage, just a man with something on his chest that needed saying. "Mr. Rhys," he began, offering his hand. Solomon paused, then shook it. "I owe you an apology." Solomon met his eyes. "An apology is a start, but it doesn't erase a system." Silas nodded. He looked tired. Not from travel, from truth. "I know," he said. "We've reviewed everything. The footage, the comms, the reports. And I want you to know, Cam Lively is no longer with us." Solomon didn't flinch. He was just a symptom. Silas sighed. "I'm not proud of how long it took me to see it. And yet," Solomon said quietly, "you showed up." Passengers moved around them, luggage rolling, heads turning. But the two men stayed still, until Solomon added, "If you really want to change something, don't start with me. Start with your training manuals, your hiring practices, the assumptions in your silence." Silas absorbed that, then nodded. Slower this time. "You have my word." Solomon stepped past him, paused, then looked back. "Make sure it means something when you say it. Words don't fly as far as actions." And with that, he walked into the terminal. Naomi caught up with him just before the escalator. She was breathless, holding her phone like a torch. "They're already calling it the 2A incident. Everyone's talking about you." Solomon smiled softly. "Let them talk." He stepped onto the escalator. Naomi followed. "So, what's next?" Solomon looked ahead and answered, "We keep flying, higher, with no one left behind." Seattle greeted them with a drizzle not heavy enough to blur vision, but enough to make everything shimmer. The kind of rain that didn't rush. It lingered, soft, like grace. Solomon Rhys stood at the curb, coat collar turned up against the breeze, his luggage by his side. But it wasn't the weight he noticed. It was the feeling. Something had lifted. Inside the terminal, Naomi Vu sat cross-legged on a bench, rewatching the footage. Not for clicks, not for views, but to remember the look in his eyes when he said, "I just sat down." The simplicity of that moment carried generations of weight, and now it was making people sit up. A text popped up from her editor. "Whatever you're writing, make sure it doesn't just go viral. Make it go deep." She already had the title. The sky has room for everyone. Back outside. Solomon's ride pulled up, a modest hybrid. But the man who stepped out was anything but. Dr. Elijah Rhys, Solomon's younger brother, tall, thoughtful, a medical researcher at the CDC. "L," Solomon said, smiling. "You actually came." Elijah grinned and opened the trunk. "Of course I did. You made national news. Man." Solomon chuckled. "I didn't do anything." Elijah looked at him. "You didn't react. And that did everything." They drove in silence for a bit. Then Elijah asked, "You okay?" Solomon nodded. "Just tired of being reminded how invisible we still are." Elijah gripped the steering wheel. "But you weren't invisible today." Solomon looked out the window. "I wasn't alone today." Across the country, Silas Marin sat in his office, staring at a photo of his staff. Most had no idea what had happened on flight NA-77, but he did, and for the first time in his 18-year career, he issued a personal letter to every Skylure employee. This company will no longer operate from assumed innocence. We will no longer protect policies that punish people for simply being present. The sky has room for everyone, and so must we. Attached to the email, a mandate for new training, new accountability, new leadership structures. It wasn't a PR move. It was a reckoning. Back in Seattle, the Rhys brothers sat on a bench at their childhood neighborhood park, a place where their father once read newspapers and their mother taught them to dream beyond the block. Now, Solomon watched the kids on the swings. Their voices rose like music, careless and free. "I used to wonder," Solomon said quietly, "what it would feel like to just move through the world without bracing." Elijah didn't speak, just rested a hand on his brother's shoulder. Later that week, Solomon returned to his office. The staff greeted him like always. No parades, no speeches, just a nod from his assistant. "Welcome back, Mr. Rhys," and a folded note on his desk. "Thank you for sitting down. You helped me stand up E.M. Aaron Malloy." He placed it beside the drawing the little boy had given him. Two objects, paper and ink. But together they held a movement. That night, Naomi's article went live. It didn't start with outrage. It didn't need to. It began with one sentence. He said nothing, but he made everyone listen. The piece trended, not because of shock, but because of truth. Solomon received emails, hundreds, some angry, most grateful. One from a man in Milwaukee. "I work at an airport. My job was to look past people. Today, I looked at them. Thanks to you." Another, from a teenager in Dallas. "I want to be an engineer like you. Now I know I can." Weeks passed, then months. But the story never really ended. It ripples. In every gate agent who takes a second look at a boarding pass. In every passenger who doesn't assume someone doesn't belong. In every executive who no longer says, "This is just how it's always been." And in every person, black, brown, bold, or broken, who chooses to sit down with their head held high, because sometimes the quietest acts carry the loudest echoes, and sometimes all it takes to ground a culture of bias is for one man to take his rightful seat and not move. What does it take to be seen? For Solomon Rhys, it wasn't his money, not his suit, not even his title as a CEO. It took being denied, humiliated so the world could finally see what he had been carrying all along: strength without noise, dignity without revenge, and power without cruelty. His story isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about every person who's ever been told, "You don't belong here," simply because of the color of their skin. But Solomon didn't scream. He didn't lash out. He sat, with grace, and in doing so, he brought an entire airline to its knees, because silence, when rooted in truth, can echo louder than any headline. To every viewer who watched till the end, thank you. May this story stir something in you: compassion, awareness, courage. Let it remind us, the sky has room for everyone, and so should we. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us tell more stories that matter. We'll see you in the next video with voices that deserve to be heard. Until then, stay kind, stay awake.